there, well, welcome to the third in the series of videos we've developed to help train facilitators looking to take teams through using the Planning Scope module, one of the modules we've developed as we've updated Conservation by Design. And in this presentation, what I'll be doing is getting a lot more details in terms of using the tool. So I'll talk about how you can prepare, set the team up for success. And then I'm going to go through each of the steps in the Mural board and really, talk you through how some tips and some tricks that can help you really be successful as a facilitator. Now, I am assuming this if you've reached this video, if you're listening to me speaking now, that you do already have an understanding of how we've approached updating Conservation by Design, what we mean by a module, the other modules that are available in addition to the planning scope, and that you've watched the overview video for the facilitated training. You have a sense of the different resources we've developed for training. And then finally, that you've listened to the introductory video where I cover the tool and the workshop at a high level. So if any of those elements are missing, I do encourage you to go back to conservationtraining.org and do listen to those recordings first, because I won't be covering the same ground here today. Now, if you have listened to those videos, you'll know that this presentation is really designed specifically for facilitators that have a team that you're preparing to take through the Planning Scope module. The idea here is that, when you reach that point in the process, you're really going to want to have much more detailed information, because you'll be getting ready to take the team through that experience. Now, that's not to say that if you don't yet have a team that, this presentation isn't for you. But I will say that, it would be hard for you to retain some of the detailed information I'm going to offer if it's several months before you actually take a team through the process. So you may find that your time is better spent with other tasks, and you can come back and listen to this recording, when you're ready to take a team through that experience. So let's begin then with the initial stages of taking a team through the workshop. So I'm assuming at this point in time that you have a team that has decided they want to go through the Planning Scope module, and you're going to be serving as a facilitator for them in that experience. And they might have decided that because they've looked at the Conservation by Design website, they've reviewed the materials on the different modules, they've decided this one is fit for purpose, or that it may be something where they've had an initial conversation with you as a facilitator. You've helped them to understand the range of modules available, and through those conversations, they've selected the Planning Scope module as fit for their needs. So we'll start off with that assumption. They've decided this is the right approach for them to take, the right tool for their needs. So the first thing you need to do then is you need to set up a scoping call with a strategy lead. Sometimes, a couple of other team members may join, but certainly the strategy lead should be there. And that scoping call really serves a number of different purposes. Firstly, it helps you, if you don't already, get to know the team a little bit. And in the case of the Planning Scope module, what will be particularly important is to understand, are there known issues that the team is going to want to step through and to resolve as they go through using this tool. Having that information will help you as facilitators guide the conversation. It might help you prioritize, which factors you dig deeper on. It'll just generally help set you up for success. The scoping call is obviously also a time for the strategy lead to ask questions of you to get an understanding of the module, maybe some of the key steps, so that they themselves are prepared to support their team. It also serves two very tactical purposes. There are two things that you'll want to come out of the scoping call knowing. The first is, who should be on the invite list for the workshop? Who should be part of the conversation part of the team here. Now, in this case, this particular module, unlike our other modules with Conservation by Design, where we do encourage teams to bring interested parties, to bring partners to the table as you actually go through a planning step, we actually suggested in this case, it generally is just the Nature Conservancy staff that participate. And that's because there's essentially two categories of teams that take advantage of the Planning Scope module. One category is teams that are newly forming, that it might be a newer strategy, it might be a group that's coalescing in a different way. And they're looking to have some initial conversations. They're not really certain of elements of scope, or at least not certain of whether or not there's agreement among team members. Second category is teams where they actually know that there is some divergence, some important divergence in scope, and they're looking to have conversations to resolve those key differences. And in both those cases, these conversations can be a little bit sensitive, and so probably more appropriate for the team to just consist of those Nature Conservancy staff that are engaged. And that's guidance that you can offer to the strategy lead as you have that scoping call. Now, that said, it is absolutely vital that the participants in the workshop include a really good range of those folks engaged with the strategy, preferably, all of the key members of staff that are going to be meaningfully working on that strategy. And the reason for that is that, the entire purpose here is to surface and resolve those key points of divergence in scope if they exist. And so if you're missing key voices, you can come out of the planning scope thinking you're aligned, step into another module, another conversation, and quickly realize that actually, there's some more work to do there. So really important that you convey that to the strategy lead. Really important that they make sure that the folks engaged in the workshop have that diversity of voices and perspectives that you want to understand and support the team in enabling. The other thing that you're going to want to do in the scoping call or shortly thereafter is actually go ahead and schedule the workshop itself. Now, my recommendation is, if at all possible, schedule a 3-hour time block. You generally don't need that long. Typically, it takes about 2.5 hours for a team to go through this tool. But that said, having a little bit of extra time just gives you a little bit of buffer to make sure that, if you're having some really rich, really important conversations, that you're not sort of running up against the clock and unable to, to conclude in a satisfying way. I would say that, anything less than 2.5 hours and you're really not setting yourself or the team up for success. And it is likely that, you will have teams that ask you at some point in time, can we do this in an hour? Can we do this in an hour and a half? And I do really want to encourage you to feel empowered as a facilitator in saying no to that. Our tools, our modules have been developed to be, effective and efficient. We really do help teams go through these steps in the process in a as brief a period of time as possible. But because of that, if we reduce that time further, it makes it highly unlikely that the team will actually have enough time to have the right kinds of conversations, come to the right decisions. And I'll say that, in my own experience, if a team is unable to set aside, a few hours to have a conversation about the scope of a strategy, really important conversation, then they're generally not set up for success. And it's not a good use of your time or for the team's time to have a conversation that ultimately, doesn't advance their needs. So we have, the first step then is to have that scoping call conversation and to go ahead then and actually schedule that workshop with the team. Now, about a week prior to, or at least a week prior to the workshop actually kicking off, you're going to want to make sure that the team members, all of those team members that are participating, have a link to the introductory video for participants. So that will provide them with an overview of the tool so that they'll know what they can expect, what those key steps are. And it also will outline the pre-work that almost every team we work with decides to undertake. And so that pre-work will help them, when they come into the workshop, they'll have undertaken step 3, and I'll be showing the mural board here in just a moment. They'll be have step 3 largely completed, which will help expedite the process for you and for them as well. So that's an important part of things, is making sure they have that information as well. I also will say that, as you start thinking about preparing for that first workshop, there are a number of things that, I'd really encourage you to do. So the first is, open up the facilitator's guide. In fact, you might find it helpful to have the facilitator's guide open as I go through the training here today. Take a look at each of the sections. What I do myself is I practice, covering the introductions to each of the sections for each of the steps. The language in the facilitator's guide has been developed through testing with real teams and refined based on that process. Having really clear instructions for each of the steps so that all of those team members know what it is that they're meant to be doing will save you a lot of time, and will save some of the storming that can occur if different people interpret things in different ways. So having that ready to hand, having practiced that will really help set you up for success. The other thing that you should do is make sure that you yourself are comfortable with using the mural board. If that is the venue in which you're going to be undertaking the workshop, which is typically the case. Typically, we're doing this either in a remote setting, or even if we have team members around, we're actually, around a real table in real life, we actually are directly entering information into the mural board. So, there is basic functionality that you will need to be able to undertake in Mural in order to be able to take the team through using the tool itself. And I will say that, being facile, being able to undertake these key tasks fairly rapidly will help you get through the workshop in the time that is set aside for each of the steps. You'll have to move fairly quickly. So some of that basic functionality, includes things like being able to zoom in and zoom out, lock and unlock content so that, team members aren't accidentally dragging things around, create new sticky notes and delete sticky notes, move sticky notes across, and then also be able to, bulk copy and move sticky notes in that way as well through pasting. So if you're unfamiliar with those functions, what I'd encourage you to do is go ahead, open up the mural board and practice. You can use the back, try something, you can reset that step, try it again. Just make sure you're comfortable with that. And I would also encourage you, as we go through the training, particularly as I start sharing my screen here in a moment to look at the mural board, go ahead and open up a copy of the mural board yourself. It can be hard on Zoom for you to be able to see the details that I'll be looking at on my screen. So having your own version of the mural board open will help you be able to zoom in to the level of resolution that you would like to have. The other thing you're going to want to make sure in terms of mural is that the link works. We hope that there are no problems at all with that, but you don't want to sort of get to that workshop, be all excited, and then have participants having issues with actually accessing the board itself. So typically what I do is I ask a friend, a colleague, if I'll share the link with them and just make sure that they can get into the board so I can resolve any technical issues before the workshop starts itself. One thing, just to reiterate from earlier training videos that I've offered here is if you do get ready for that first experience, is to really trust the tool yourself, particularly if this is your first time, second time running through this tool. We really do encourage our facilitators for those first few go rounds there to trust the tool and to use the wording and the guidance in the facilitator's guide. And that includes sticking to the time boxes, the time allocations we have for each of the key steps. Where facilitators can quickly get into hot waters if they start sort of customizing on the fly, switching up steps. At that point, you'll have far less confidence that you can get the team successfully through this process in the time that we have available. And the time blocking is designed to be sort of long enough for a team to go through each of the steps, but really sort of no more time than that. One of the challenges we often have at the Conservancy is that we over-resource strategy planning. We need to think about every step in strategy planning, including the planning scope module, as really being something where we're using our best available sort of knowledge today to take a step forward into the future, recognizing that as we actually move forward with developing and implementing our strategy, we're going to learn things that mean that we need to adaptively manage, and that includes considering sort of revisiting scope. So for you as a facilitator, hopefully it sort of takes the pressure off a little bit to know that, you're not setting things in stone today, or when you go through the workshop with a team. So if they do discover new information, new learning down the road, they can obviously come back and revisit the scope. And you should convey that to the teams themselves as well. This is something where, this is designed to be a good enough process to help the team take a step forward, not an exhaustive process as if we are, deterministically setting the future for this strategy, throughout the entire lifespan of the strategy. So we'll assume as we step into the mural board here that the team you're working with has gone ahead and completed the pre-work. Again, that is typically the case. You will see in the facilitator's guide, and again, I encourage you to be looking at that guide as we go along here, pausing and reading the guide. You will see that we have different time allocations for the earlier steps in the process, depending upon whether or not team members have undertaken that pre-work. So you can readily adjust, the time allocation that you have there based on whether or not the team has undertaken that pre-work. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is, share my screen, and I'll start walking you through the mural board itself. So if you'll bear with me a moment while I make that happen, we can move forward from that. So what you can see now on my screen, I hope, is that you can see a sort of a zoomed out version of that mural board. This should be familiar to you from the previous training videos that we provided here. And the first thing, when the team, joins you for that workshop, the first thing to do is obviously to welcome everyone. And you'll see that in the top left of the board here. We begin with a connection. This is an opportunity for you, obviously, if you don't know already, all of the team members to get to know them a little bit. And also an opportunity for you to, for the team members to kind of find their feet and get themselves centered. So even if the teams work together for some time, do begin with that kind of welcome and with that icebreaker. Now, I am assuming here again that the team has watched this team you're working with, you're supporting, has watched the introductory video themselves. They know the key steps in the process. They kind of know what it is that why they're here. And so really that leaves you with just a few things that you need to do before you actually step into using the tool. So the first of these is to actually go ahead and assign roles. And you'll see that as I zoom into the board here, you'll see that in the top left. So many of these roles will be played by you. And at this point, you'll see that my name is plugged into the blue boxes here for timekeeper. The gardener, which is the garden again, is where we capture sort of key things that surface that are outside of the scope of the planning scope module. But the team is going to want to resolve through future conversations. So those typically I will as facilitator, you will populate in the garden. And obviously you will be serving as facilitators. Your name will be in the blue box down here. And that leaves sort of two roles that you will want to have the team fill. The first of those is having somebody who can kind of just keep an eye on how the team is doing and flag with you as a facilitator if there's a need for a pause, if there's something going on that you haven't picked up on yourself. So that's what we call the vibe checker. You'll want a single member of the team to serve in that role. The other box here is a relatively important one for this particular module, because this is what we call the ultimate decision maker. Now, while we hope, and you'll see this described in the facilitator's guide, the aim is to reach consensus decisions here. When you get to step 6 of the process, and you're having the facilitated conversations about the elements that that are sort of unresolved in terms of scope, you'll often find yourself sort of you'll have some rich dialogue, and you'll reach a point where either there's an obvious decision and people are on board, or there's a leaning towards sort of one direction or another, and you need somebody to help sort of endorse making that decision. Almost invariably, this is the strategy lead, but there are occasions where there might be a member of staff that the team really trusts, and they like to put that name forward. I would say that you might sort of think about covering this as part of the scoping call as well. I'm just getting a sense from the strategy lead if they are comfortable with somebody else playing that role, or if they feel like they have to play that role, so that you're not trying to sort of make that decision on the fly and read the room a little bit. But again, typically, I say 9 times out of 10, the name that you plug into the ultimate decision maker box will be the lead for the particular strategy that you are undertaking with the team. So if the team has watched undertaken the pre-work, watched the video, again, you can move much more quickly through the initial steps here, but you still will want to pause and make sure that give it a little bit of space for any questions that might come up. Now, in general, in our modules, we try as facilitators to avoid getting into very open dialogue that's outside of the scope of the conversation. And so, when you ask, if folks ask questions where that they'll be getting to them later on in the process, obviously we'll be getting there in a moment here, when that those are going to come up later in the process, you should feel comfortable saying, we'll be covering that later in the process. I'd also encourage you, whenever you open up a Q&A session, you'll see this again described in the facilitator's guide, use the timer function on the mural board to set a timer and stick to that time. So in general, sticking to time throughout your, this facilitation will be key to your success. That said, obviously deploy some emotional intelligence. If, another 30 seconds, another minute is going to really help the team resolve, a conversation in an important way, you can, the tool and the timeline will readily accommodate that. You just want to avoid something where team members are really dragging out a conversation in ways that they don't need to, which is where the time boxing comes in, or you're creating conditions where there's very open dialogue that really isn't helping the team advance through. And that, again, is where you trusting the tool and then really asking the team to trust the tool as well. It's going to be vital. That really is sort of your friend in helping to avert some of the open dialogue that can often trip up strategy planning exercises. So once we've gone through the introduction, we have the team together, we've assigned roles, we've had that initial Q&A. Then you will obviously move into step 3. Now, if the team has undertaken the pre-work, they will have pre-populated this, or they will have ideas on pieces of paper, and you can ask them to go ahead and fill in those ideas. Again, it's good, and I'm myself during this training not going to voice over the instructions for each of those steps. Those instructions that you will provide as facilitator are included in the facilitator's guide. But I will highlight one or two as we go along. And one that's important to emphasize at this stage is that you're not trying to focus on an exhaustive laundry list of all of the elements of the scope of this strategy that team members can come up with. You're trying to help the team hone in on those really key elements, and specifically those key elements where they think, or there's a potential for some divergence in terms of whether or not those factors are in scope or out of scope. And so providing that reminder at the beginning of step 3 is important. Now, if the team has undertaken the pre-work, if they have their content on a piece of paper, you're going to need to give them some time to add that content to the board. If that content's already there, you should still give them a few minutes to add additional content, and the exact time allocation is again described in the facilitator's guide. And you'll also see guidance there around helping team members avoid just replicating what their colleagues are writing. There's no real benefit to that. Now, for you as facilitator, you will be dynamically managing the mural board throughout this workshop series. And so what I typically ask teams to do is to, if they're adding content for the first time, or if they're, deciding if there's anything additional that they want to add, if they have done the pre-work, I'll ask them to begin with the place-based sort of geographic category that's here at the top, and then sort of work their way down the list. And the reason that I have them do this is that what you will need to do is to be copying content from step 3 across to step 4. And you should have, in preparation, again, this is described in the facilitator's guide, you should have made sure at this point that there are enough rows in step 4 for each of the 3 categories, geography, target-based, and thematic. You should have made sure that there's enough rows, and you actually have assigned each row to a team member if you're confident of who is going to show up. So all of that work should have been done before you started the workshop here. So what you will then need to do is to copy the content that has been generated in step 3 into the rows in step 4. And I'll just give you a quick demonstration of what that looks like here. So this is one of the functions you will want to be able to do, which is that bulk copy, and be able to shift stickies around. So I will replicate that for each of the team members that is participating, so that each team member has exactly the same content to sort through. So the reason that you ask them to start at the top of step 3 in adding content or in adding additional content is that you can actually often, you'll be able to tell that, you know, that there's nothing additional to be added, for example, in the geographic category, and you can actually start sorting, moving content across while they're still working, you know, on the categories down below. So one of those ways of finding a little bit of an efficiency here. And in fact, what I'll often do is I'll copy the contents from, you know, from the geographic and the target based across to step 4. And then if the team's sort of done with adding content, I'll actually then provide the overview of step 4, describe what they're meant to do. Then I'll do that for you here in a moment. And then actually they can start the sorting exercise they'll be doing while I actually then carry across the remaining content from step 3 to the bottom category. Hopefully that makes sense. But again, it's a way of just finding some efficiencies and helping to really use your team and the team's team as wisely, the team's time rather, as wisely as possible. So what occurs then in step 4 is that the team members are going to take the content that they individually generated in step 3, and they're going to go through another individual exercise where they sort it into the 3 categories off to the right here. So green is they think it's in scope, yellow is they think it's they're not sure, gray is that they think it's out of scope. So the idea is that the team members will look at each of these factors and they will drag it across and drop it in the relevant box. Now, this may be a moment where you need to provide a very brief primer to team members on how to perform that action if they're not familiar with Mural. Obviously, this is one of the most straightforward actions, and generally that kind of dragging is common to so many different software platforms. Most staff members just can, you know, sort of have that intuitively if they don't have familiarity with Mural itself. So they'll be dragging that content across. You know, again, you'll see the instructions you should provide to them before they get into the step provided in the facilitator's guide. One thing you will need to be cognizant of here is that some team members will move more quickly than others. Obviously, you want to make sure that you're giving team members enough time, and particularly if there are cultural differences, cultural norms, or individual differences, you don't want team members to feel like they're being sort of rushed beyond what is feasible. But one way that you can help people move through this step, you know, a little bit more quickly is by encouraging them to think of this as sort of first draft thinking. Trust their gut. You know, this is not something where they are making a decision in step 4. They really just, you know, should sort of feel like they probably have enough knowledge intuitively to make this kind of, you know, categorization decisions here. What I will also say you'll notice as a facilitator is that where there are strong perspectives, you begin to see the signature in this step. People will drag things across quite quickly, and often you'll see the same factors, you know, showing up in out of scope and in scope. And that is often that kind of signal to you that, you know, when you get to step 6, those might be areas for you to particularly pay attention to. So at the conclusion of step 4, then each team member has sorted, you know, those stickies into each of the categories. Okay, and then you can move on to step 5. Now, I do want to be honest that step 5 for you as a facilitator is probably the trickiest step in terms of sort of the mechanics of the Mural board. Really want to encourage you, you know, before you get into the workshop, read the facilitator's guide, because for this step, I have very detailed kind of instructions for how to go through this exercise. Because what you're going to be doing is you're going to be sorting the individual categorization that's just been undertaken in step 4 into sort of a sense of where the group is. And what you're looking to do is to take, you know, each factor that was identified in step 3, and that factor should end up in either the green, the pink, or the yellow boxes here. So green is in scope, so the team agrees it's in scope. Pink is it's out of scope, team agrees it's out of scope, and the yellow is unsure. Now, what I'm not going to try and do here is voice over those instructions, but I will say that they are the most efficient way to go through this sorting exercise. Now, you'll ask the team at this point in time to take a break because this is work that, having them sort of sitting watching you do it is not particularly useful. You may well actually, if you have somebody on the team who is somewhat facile with Mural, often the strategy lead, you might ask if they're willing to give you a hand here, and you can choose, give them one of the categories to sort while you sort the other two categories. That's one way to kind of speed this up a little bit. But having read the instructions and following the instructions will help you go through step 5 much more quickly. If you're trying to figure out how to do this on the fly, the logic of it can be quite difficult. But it is once you think it through, it's quite a straightforward sort of sorting exercise. And really, what you're trying to do in step 5 here is to figure out for step 6, what are the factors that you need to have sort of a conversation around? Yeah. So once you've got sort of the factors that are in the green and they're in the pink, the remaining focus of your time and energy then is on those that are sort of in the yellow boxes for step 5. And just a quick reminder, I will zoom out here to remind you that below the geographic factor, there are similar boxes here for the other 2 remaining factors, kind of scrolling down through the mural board. So step 6 then is actually where you're going to spend a good chunk of your time during this workshop, and you'll see that reflected in the facilitator's guide again in the time allocations there, because this is where you actually take the team, support the team in having facilitated conversations. And the goal of step 6, so there's really sort of 2 goals. The first is for the team members to make a decision for those factors that they all begin in the yellow box. At the beginning of step 6, you've carried the factors in the yellow box in step 5 across to the yellow box in step 6 for each of the three categories. And your goal is to sort those into either in scope or out of scope, so that by the end of step 6, there's nothing left in the yellow box. So that's sort of one of the key purposes. I will say that a lot of the value in this tool in general, and particularly in this step, is for team members to actually just have the chance to hear from one another. So often these points of divergence in scope really come down to the team never having an opportunity to actually talk things through, to understand, to empathize with different perspectives. And so these conversations are often really rich, even though that you will see in the facilitator's guide, you have to keep them time boxed in order to get through all of the factors. So the way this generally works is you'll introduce the step 6 to the team using the language in the facilitator's guide. You'll explain to them this concept of fist to 5 that is in the top of the board here. And if this is unfamiliar to you, it's a way of sort of quickly reading where individual team members are around a potential decision. So I won't step through it now, but I do encourage you to read the descriptor there. And you don't need to use fist to 5 for every factor that you sort through. But if there's somewhere you're like, okay, it's a little bit hard to read where folks are here, or I'm getting a sense that some of the participants feel strongly about this, and I want to get a real read on that. Fist to 5 is a quick way of gaining that information. Now, in general, and this is throughout the tool itself, but particularly relevant here, you will encourage team members, if they're unsure and if there's sort of unresolved kind of conversation around a factor, to leave it in scope. When the team decides to take something out of scope, it's actually quite an important decision, because you're essentially saying as a team, we're not going to invest more resources in this, in discussing or in further work on this factor until we might gain evidence or learning that suggests otherwise. Yeah. So in general, if there's uncertainty, your team's much safer keeping it in scope. The other purpose of step 6, sort of ancillary but really important benefit, is that in those conversations around each of the factors, what you'll often hear as facilitator is things like, well, we need to think about this, but it's really not key to our strategy, and we're not going to be taking any actions around it. And it's just something we need to kind of keep an eye on. And to kind of capture that sort of a little bit more nuance, what we have off to the left then are these 2, what we call bullseye diagrams. The top one is for the geographic scope category, and the bottom one is for the target-based and thematic factors. And what you can and sort of should be doing as the team's having those conversations is make that decision. The team makes a decision on whether or not it's in or out of scope, and I'll step you through the script there in just a moment. And once they've made that decision, if you have a sense of where that factor then lives within the scope of the strategy, you can copy it across to the bullseye diagram and place it in the appropriate place. So for example, with geographic scope, if you zoom in here, you'll see that in the green circle, we place factors that might determine specific target places within the larger boundary. So this bullseye diagram for geographic scope is really sort of thinking about nested geographies. That's actually a little bit different than the one below for the target-based and thematic factors, where if you zoom into the green circle, for example, in the middle here, you'll see that this is a factor that the team says is just core. This is something that's at the heart of the strategy and absolutely can be a focus. And then as you move away from that, to the next level, there's something that might be secondary, sort of an important aspect, but not a key focus. So you can capture that kind of information as you have the conversations then in step 6. So let me talk a little bit about what those conversations sort of look like, and you'll see again a detailed script for these in the facilitator's guide. But essentially what you'll do is you'll choose a factor and ask a team member to make a recommendation as to whether or not it should be considered in scope or out of scope, and provide a brief explanation as to why they think that should be the case. And then you open it up for other team members to use the raise hand function. It depends on the group size as to how you want to manage this, but they might offer an alternative perspective. And just you have that facilitated sort of back and forth. And so, the idea there is to sort of hear enough voices to get a sense of kind of where things are, where the group is around this particular factor. Often the role you'll play, you'll hear a few voices, and generally sort of, that process can play out in, 3 or 4 minutes is often long enough for that kind of back and forth kind of facilitated conversation. Often what you'll then do as a facilitator is sort of make a recommendation to yourself. What I'm hearing from the group is X. Does that sound right to you? And that's where the fist of 5 can kind of come in if you're like, I'm not sure I got that right. As also where that ultimate decision maker role can come in. So generally you will actually sort of make a recommendation to the group. And then if there's still some uncertainty there, or that's where you can ask the ultimate decision maker to play that particular role. You want to sort of restrict the use of that role if you can, but if it's a conversation where there's been enough dialogue, then the ultimate decision maker steps in. Again, that's a point where you do encourage them, if in doubt, keep the factor in scope. In terms of which factors, sort of the order to go through factors for step 6, I generally begin with one that, based on the conversation so far, seems low risk, where the team can kind of take a first go through, try their hand, but it's likely to be sort of, somewhat of a more straightforward conversation. And then from there, I as much as possible, try and tackle the thorniest kind of factors first, keeping to that time boxing, but recognizing that sometimes those will take a little bit more time and emotional energy to step through. If you're not sure of which of those are most important, you can ask the ultimate decision maker to sort of help guide you in that process. But you want to make sure, obviously, that you're not spending a lot of time between factors debating which one to choose next. And in general, it's fairly straightforward to figure out where you might focus your attention. And you can move up and down among the categories. You don't have to sort of complete geographic before you go down to target-based or thematic. Leave the factors that are least important to the end. If you were to run out of time, obviously the team could probably sort through those on their own using the same process more readily than if they're really the difficult ones where that facilitated conversation is so important. So the conclusion of step 6, then again, there are no factors left in the yellow boxes. The team's made some decisions about moving factors. You've got the factors represented in your bullseye diagram, so that the team has that record of where they sort of place these things in terms of scope. So then we get to step 7 and 8, which is where you just want to make sure that, as the team leaves, they know exactly what they're going to do next. What you don't want to do is have the team leave and be like, well, we just did this. Now what happens? Yeah. So the goal then in step 7 and step 8 is to help the team have a clear sort of next step action items. And you'll see, described here that there are a number of different sort of products. And again, in the facilitator's guide, there's more details about, how to have this particular sort of part of the conversation. These different sort of outputs listed down in step 8, you can choose among these in terms of which ones are sort of more or less relevant. Right down at the bottom, you will see a box that says sort of how can this information be used? And this is specifically if the team is going on to what is often the next sort of module in the process, which for many teams would be a situation analysis, and what they might do if there is no additional kind of, they're not going to be taking on any more of the modules themselves. On a rare occasion, you might find that the team is really fatigued at the end of the workshop and is unable to sort of find the energy to really come up with those clear action items. If that's the case, what you should do is make sure you have an action item to connect with the strategy lead in the near future in order to make sure that they have that kind of closure. So I appreciate this training video has been a little longer than the other videos, but I did want to get into more detail with you here. I do hope this information has been useful to you. Really appreciate your time and attention. Appreciate your support for Conservation by Design and the strategy planning tool in general. Thank you so much. And please let me know if you have any questions.